This is Court Watch with Alex Swoyer, and I'm excited to bring you the latest episode of my podcast, where I am joined by Carrie Severino, president of the Judicial Crisis Network and a former clerk to Justice Clarence Thomas. The justices return October 7th to kick off their new term after a 3-month summer recess. We'll hear from Carrie about what major legal battles we should be tracking as the justices start their new year. And we will also get her take on the latest leak out of the court. On September 15th, the New York Times published an article suggesting Chief Justice Roberts was orchestrating wins for former President Trump. Hey, Carrie, thanks so much for taking time to break down the upcoming term for us, what we have to look forward to right now, and potentially major cases coming down the pike. But first, I mentioned briefly in my introduction that there was a New York Times article, I think it was September 15th, and it discussed a confidential memo that the New York Times obtained. They quoted from it. They kind of suggested in the story that Chief Justice Roberts was trying to orchestrate wins for former President Trump in the previous term, like the immunity case. I think they also talk about the Fisher case, which was that January 6th obstruction charge. One of the quotes they pulled actually from that memo said something to the effect of, like Chief Justice Roberts said, the lower court saw something, one way, but I suspect our separation of powers analysis would be different, something to that effect, which I thought, that doesn't mean he's orchestrating a win. That just might mean he knows how his colleagues think. So I thought I'd ask you, what do you make of this? It's the second leak since the Dobbs ruling, the reversal of Roe v. Wade that we saw in 2022. This is a big deal, I guess, that they did get this memo and all these interviews that went with that article. But really, what did you make of it?
Yeah, well, first of all, as you alluded to, I think there are people trying to overplay what was going on there and make it seem like, oh, wow, this is really political of him, for him to kind of telegraph where he thought the court was going on this. Folks, that's not political. He's writing an internal memo. This is not something he's writing to the New York Times. This is not something that is intended for public disclosure. This is something he's writing to his colleagues. They are all the people who have votes in these cases, too. All he can do is kind of persuasive in emails to them. That is not political.
No.
What is political is leaking that to a national paper in an attempt to sully the opinion of the court or the opinion of one of the justices. And so I think we need to be really clear. Even what they released, I think was totally within a reasonable kinds of things you might write in a memo to your colleagues. Now, the fact that this is leaked is a huge thing and a major problem for the court, as you alluded to. Like Dobbs was a unprecedented leak of a draft opinion, but leaking these kinds of memos is also incredibly damaging. And it was also information leaked about some of the internal discussion.
Yeah.
And that's really a concern. Can the justices even trust their own colleagues or some of the really high up people at the court? Because, honestly, very few people would have had the type of information that we saw.
Exactly.
Really.
It was, I will say, in terms of the reporting, the anonymous interviews, I guess, that were given, it seemed like there were so many. The fact that was able to be obtained is a major deal. The leaked memo is, as you alluded to, a big deal. But the memo itself, I guess if I'm comparing Dobbs, Dobbs, the leak was forward-looking. This is this memo, what they're quoting from, it's kind of like looking back. And if you listen to the oral arguments, you knew where the Chief Justice stood. It wasn't like there was any sort of, revelation here. The only revelation really is that the leak was obtained, right? The memo was obtained.
Absolutely. It's the justices talk to each other about their opinions on these cases. So especially on an issue that they're going to be voting on, in this case, when to take certain cases. So it's not information that is surprising for them to have discussions about. And the idea that this is, you can kind of just tell by the way it was framed that the goal of the leaker is to try to drum this up into oh wow, how could he do this story? Not at all. This is clearly what's going on here, because as you point out, it doesn't even have any forward going impact. Clearly, the goal is to try to damage the reputation of the court and really to damage the institution of the court, because now I think the justices have to look over their shoulder and go, gosh, can I actually do my work knowing that it's going to be kept in confidence, or are these things going to be weaponized by people who disagree with my decisions to try to make me look bad, which we've seen. The Chief Justice is only the latest in that type of thing.
Yeah.
We've seen it against Justice Thomas. We've seen it against Justice Alito. We've seen it against Justice Barrett. I mean, this is a regular Justice Kavanaugh. Every time they do anything, someone's trying to make it look somehow nefarious when that couldn't be farther from the truth.
Yeah, and I mean, starting your new term with something like a leak that just occurred, we haven't seen anything from the court, I guess, on this yet. I don't know if there will be any sort of investigation like they did with the Dobbs leak. Do you think they should try to conduct something?
I would think so. I think it's a really bad situation if people think they can leak internal documents with impunity. And remember, after the Dobbs leak, a lot of us said, hey, if this person isn't found, then this will not be the last leak. Now, thankfully, we haven't seen other opinion leaks, but maybe this is evidence that, hey, you know what, when there's no consequences, these types of bad behavior just continue to repeat themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess we'll just jump into the start of the term. They have already scheduled a few major disputes that we'll hear arguments in. And if one of them, for example, we've been tracking is there seems to be some transgender rights cases moving through the courts, and one is already scheduled. I think it's a law out of Tennessee. It bans transgender surgeries, puberty blockers for minors. And so it was challenged by a group of parents and their transgender minors or their children, and now the justices will hear it. I think there's like roughly 24 other states that have similar legislation they're looking at. So how big of a deal is this case? Is this the biggest case so far that they're going to hear that we know of? What's your take?
Yeah. I think in terms of things granted so far, and really we're very early on in the grant process. It's only a fraction of the cases they'll hear this year have been granted. So there's still a lot more to come. But in terms of the ones they've granted so far, this is the biggest issue, and it's an issue that I think, as you alluded to, is going to keep coming up. It's not just Tennessee; it's a lot of other states, and this is a trend we've really seen worldwide, where there's a lot of countries, even those countries that initially were very forward moving on youth transgender surgeries, are now pulling back and saying, hey, you know what? The initial evidence isn't great. We should be proceeding with more caution on this, because when you're talking about dealing with a minor, there's a lot of long-term decision making that's happening here with kids who really aren't at an age yet where they're able to make those decisions. So I think this is an issue that's going to keep on happening. And what these parents are claiming is that there is a right in the 14th Amendment, basically, to have these transgender treatments, surgeries, hormones, many of which can, again, have lifelong impacts and cause sterility and cause people, loss of functional organs. So I think that those are the issues that Tennessee flagged and said, hey, this is something you should wait until you're of legal age to make these kind of decisions. The question is, does the Constitution say a child has a right to these treatments? As an originalist matter, I think there's no way you can imagine that's an original understanding of the Constitution. So it's pretty easy question, really, from an originalist matter. But obviously, people feel very strongly about it, so it's going to still be a very hotly debated case.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the since Bostock, really, a major LGBTQ case that they've taken. My question for you is, do you think, I know there's a cert petition out of, I think it's West Virginia, correct me if I'm wrong, is it Idaho? They have a women's sports law, and it basically protects women's sports, right? So it's a law that says you have to be a biological female to participate in sports. That's been challenged by transgender athletes. I think that's on cert petition. So, what's the likelihood that one could be added to this term? Do you think once they take one, transgender rights case, they might not be ready to dive into another aspect of that? Or anything we can glean?
Look, the justices don't want to have the court in a major public policy issue in any way. I think the challenge is what we're having is this is an issue that is being worked out in state legislatures across the country in different ways, and going both different directions, right? And you're having people asking the court to step in and stop these democratically elected laws. So as much as the court doesn't want to have to deal with this issue, they're kind of put in a position where they may have to deal with the question. I think anytime that happens, the most likely scenario is if a state law is actually struck down by a court, and they say, well, no, this law can't go on, say, protecting women in sports or what have you. Then the sum is much more on the scale for the court to take that kind of a case, because if they just stand back, then a law that's passed by the representatives of the people of that state can't go into effect. If it goes the other way, and you've got a court that upholds those laws, maybe the court is going to say, you know what, we don't have to step in here right yet. Let's let these issues continue to percolate. But just like, as I was saying, there's so many different states that are concerned about transgender surgeries for minors and other treatments that have impacts on minors. There are a lot of people really concerned across the country about the intersection between the transgender movement and women's sports. And I think the court's not going to be able to avoid this issue.
Right.
Even if they don't take it this term. And I think if a proper case presents itself, they ought to just step up and answer this question, because it's one that's really crucially important across the country. And there's a lot of states that are trying to address the issue.
Mm-hmm. What other cases are you tracking that have already been, granted for arguments?
Yeah, so right the first week of argument, there's an important case having to do with ghost guns, basically. And the question, like so many questions we've seen recently, is we've got a law on the books. In this case, it's the Gun Control Act of 1968, which has a bunch of definitions in here. It's got a definition of a firearm. It's got a definition of what is a frame or receiver. And then you've got the regulations, which often, can be, the question really here is, are they at odds with what the definitions in this law are? So one of the things that they're trying to regulate then are gun kits. And the question is, in certain ways, the law does regulate those, but in other ways, it's supposed to be regulating frames and receivers of guns. Mm-hmm. And what this administration has said is, okay, we're going to include amongst things that are a frame or receiver, anything that can readily be changed into a frame or receiver. So anything that could be easily completed, assembled, restored, or converted into a frame or receiver. So the court has to figure out, okay, can you say something that is definitely not a frame or receiver because it can be converted into one? So it's not one now. Can the government really regulate that when all the law gives them the authority to regulate is frames and receivers, not things that might be eventually turned into a frame or receiver? Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be really a statutory interpreation question.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah, it's not necessarily Second Amendment, even though we're talking about guns, but it's yeah.
Yeah, but it highlights an issue that comes up, not just in this area, but in so many areas where you've got the law, and then you've got the administration, and the Biden administration has been very adventurous in some of these cases of trying to say, hey, we want to try to we want to try to expand the reach of this law as far as we can.
Yeah, somewhat similar to like the bump stock case, right? Like something like what we just
similar
saw.
Idea.
Right.
Right. So the court's job is to say, okay, thus far and no farther. Like, how far can this law reasonably go? And we have to make sure that if it's a real change in the law, that's not to say you can't make that decision, but you have to do it through Congress. You can't make it with just the administration saying, actually, we'd like it to cover things that can be transformed into frames and receivers. Okay, great. But that might be something that Congress has to do. If their text that they've already passed and has been signed by the president doesn't cover it, then you have to go back and go to Congress the proper way.
Mm-hmm. I think that case is the second day. They're back October 8th, if I'm recalling right.
That's right.
Yeah, I that's when I am, I'm planning to be at the arguments. My other question, I guess, is I think there's a major First Amendment case. It's kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. It's presented in a unique way. It's over, Texas has a law, I guess it requires identification for adults to access pornography sites, correct? But it's been challenged by a free speech group as a First Amendment violation. Can you explain that one?
So here's the challenge. It's in a Supreme Court precedent on the books that says, material that is obscene as to minors, which is a different level of obscenity than they would consider for adults, right? We all know there's some stuff that kind of like there's PG-13 movies, like maybe this is not appropriate for a 5-year-old, but 13-year-old may be okay. Okay, now R-rated movies, maybe this is not appropriate for a 13-year-old, but you might have a 17-year-old go to this movie. Similarly, in obscenity laws, no, there's certain things that are obscene as to minors, and the state can regulate those to protect minors. And normally the courts have a relatively deferential view of standing of the level you have to be able to uphold the law, a rational basis. So as long as the state has a rational basis for why they want to limit access, in this case, to pornography to children, then we'll let it stand. And clearly the idea of saying, hey, we don't want children to we don't want children to be able to access porn. The state clearly has a rational basis for that to protect the children. The problem is here we have adults saying, yeah, but it's going to make it harder for us to view this as well because we have to verify our identification or something. And the question is whether they have a First Amendment right that means you need strict scrutiny, which means the government has to have a great reason to do it, and that it has to be narrowly tailored. Like there's no way you could protect minors from seeing the pornography without burdening the adults. If there's some way that, we could make it a little bit easier for adults to be able to get cleared by this, then the law could fail under strict scrutiny even. So it makes it very challenging for Texas to uphold their law. So the question the court's looking at is what level of scrutiny this case gets. But it's a question, having to do with sort of balancing these different types of things when you're trying to protect one group. How much of a burden on access to speech maybe can you have for the other group, the adults?
Mm-hmm. Around the same time the court granted this case, I think they granted another one that has to do with kind of, it's not related to porn, but it's vaping, flavored vapes. And I don't know if you've been tracking that one, but I thought that was interesting because they granted this one, then it was like either the same orders, I can't remember, but I remember writing them together. And it dealt with marketing, FDA regulation regarding marketing of flavored vaping products, and how I guess that it's been challenged, the FDA's denial, because of their intent was to protect youth, like not having these vapes marketed to minors. I don't know if that's one you're tracking at all.
That was one that hasn't been scheduled for argument yet, but it's interesting because they're both coming out of the Fifth Circuit. They're both coming out of the same region here, having a similar kind of concept of, okay, we want to protect children, and at what point do we choose protecting kids over adults wanting maximum freedom to do whatever they want?
Yeah. So I guess that one, okay, so they said that they'll consider that the FDA's refusal to approve these flavored e-cigarettes, whatever, vaping products. I'm not an expert on that. I don't partake. So if I'm using the wrong terms, please check me. But then also we just talked about transgender minor surgery and protecting minors from accessing porn websites. Is it wrong to look? Is there some sort of theme? All the journalists always ask, is there a theme this term? It just feels like it's like, a lot of these laws have to do with minors and security.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is that theme. I mean, the vaping law has more to do with whether the FDA checked all the boxes correctly and did its procedure correctly in terms of making this law. So it's not really, kind of like the ghost gun case is in the Second Amendment case. It's not really dealing with that question centrally, but I guess it shows you some of the issues that society as a whole is trying to deal with right now, which is why we're getting lots of laws and regulations that are touching on those issues. And that is the issue of, how can we best protect our children? They are held to a different standard than an adult would be in a lot of ways. And so how do we work that out as a society?
What other cases that have already been granted that you're tracking? Is there anyone I haven't mentioned?
Yeah, it really, we have a now I wouldn't say record low number. Maybe it is record low. I haven't done all the comparison things. So there's not that many. I mean, there are other ones that are there's some environmental cases going on. There's some other things, but nothing that I think is going to be as newsworthy as the ones we've already discussed. That said, the court, after all summer, they aren't accepting cases, right? They go out, they leave at the end of June or at the beginning of July last year, and we've had cases building up for what's going to be on September 30th. We call it the long conference because they meet in this very long conference to discuss just hundreds of cases at a time. So I expect that they probably will announce them the next week, and we'll have a lot more information about some more of these cases, and I bet we'll have a few more interesting ones to talk about after that.
Yeah, and then I know we mentioned the women's sports issue is on cert. I just covered at the D.C. Circuit, there was the oral arguments related to the Congress's law banning TikTok that's been challenged by the company, the social media platform. I think a lot of people think that could potentially be presented to the justices this term. If depending on how the D.C. Circuit rules, we expect an appeal to the justices. Any other major issues that might be in the lower courts right now that you think could make this term spicier? I guess if you think about it, we always had an abortion case scheduled already or granted already. We don't have one of those. Last time, I don't think we had the Trump cases granted at all. So, and that ended up being kind of the focus. Anything we should be keeping an eye on, not necessarily at the court yet?
Well, there are some interesting cases coming out of Hawaii, and this has to do with the city of Honolulu kind of attempting to limit greenhouse gases because they're trying to sue the companies saying you're affecting us. Now, depending on what the court does in terms of them being able to, you can have one city that has a massive lawsuit and whether they're able to, kind of do a backdoor attempt to control outside industries and businesses that way. I think that could be a really interesting question. And boy, if one city is able to sue, and Shell Oil and all these other companies, and Sunoco, for huge amounts of money, it's going to be a major problem with our energy industry. I don't know how American energy industry would be able to survive that kind of thing. So that is a potential to be very impactful. Right now, the court's waiting for the opinion of the Solicitor General as to whether they should take that case. So that's always something that flags that something they might be more interested in, and they probably recognize that it's pretty significant.
My last question before I let you go is obviously November 5th is right around the corner, Election Day. How likely is it that the Supreme Court's going to have to grapple with any sort of election-related disputes? I know it was like crazy in 2020. There was all these swing states with litigation that worked their way up to the justices. I don't know if we'll see something as widespread as that, but do you suspect they'll have to jump in on anything?
Look, every election year, there's going to be some kind of big question, especially if it's close and it looks close.
So, like Pennsylvania, all the polls are neck and neck.
Right. So I feel like there's a good chance. Now, 2020, we also had COVID to deal with, which made it even crazier than normal. So hopefully not as much going on as in 2020. But I think it's very likely the court's going to have to answer something. And, just a flag for people, there is this there's a loud peanut gallery out there that has been trying to create the impression that the court addressing issues in an emergency posture is somehow illegitimate. And this is kind of the example of why, of course, the court needs to be able to address things on an emergency basis.
Right.
You don't have time between now and November, right? There was not time to have full briefing and oral arguments, even if the court were in session right now on these things. So, we should be aware that even if the court does have to step in on one of these things, it is by the nature of the beast just going to have to do so on an expedited fashion. And, we should be glad the courts are able to do that, because otherwise, what do we want? The election suspended for 6 to 9 months or however long it normally takes for these cases to go through. It's just not feasible. But I know the court isn't excited about having to do that kind of work, because they would rather have more time to work through it as well. But I predict that if there's anything coming up, it's going to have to be one of these emergency turnaround things. Hopefully states can figure out, how to manage things
Right.
themselves in the meantime. But we're seeing lots of state courts having to deal with these questions already.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and I'll have to have you back after we get more into the term and maybe have a few more cases to discuss too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carrie. Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of Court Watch. If you have not subscribed yet to this podcast, please do so, and also feel free to email me interesting questions or topics that you want explored about the legal reporting world. I'll do my best to answer them during each episode. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Listen to my podcast, Court Watch, at WashingtonTimes.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.